Harold I, or Harold Harefoot, was King of England from November 1035 to March 1040, for just over 4 years, or around 52 months. He was the second son of the mighty King Canute, who was King of England, Norway and Denmark, and who we covered in our previous video, linked below. We don't know when King Harold was born exactly, but it could have been around the year 1015, around about the time his father Canute was crowned King of England. That would make him around 20 years old when he ascended to the throne, and in his mid-20s when he died. Let's take a look at where he fits in our timeline of kings and queens. He's here, the third Danish king from the Jelling dynasty to sit on the throne after his grandfather Sweyn Forkbeard had overthrown the previously dominant House of Wessex. For context, Harold I sat on the throne just over 900 years before our current monarch, Elizabeth II. He was the product of Canute's marriage to AElfgifu, a Mercian noblewoman. There were at the time claims that he wasn't really Canute's son, and that AElfgifu, unable to produce children, had adopted Harold and his older brother. However, given that there was opposition in England to Harold becoming king in the first place, it's possible this was just a cruel rumour. So why was there opposition to him being king? And also, why was he called Harold Harefoot? Well, his father, King Canute, had 2 wives, because later in his reign he married Emma of Normandy, the younger sister of the Duke of Normandy and the wife of a previous king of England, AEthelred the Unready. We don't know if Harold's mother AElfgifu was Canute's wife or his mistress. It's possible AElfgifu was his wife, but under pagan rites, whereas Emma was his wife under Christian law. Nevertheless, Canute's union with AElfgifu produced 2 boys, Sweyn, who would rule as King of Norway, and Harold. If you've watched a few of these videos, you'll see that this isn't the first time an incoming king has married the wife of a previous king. But why would Canute marry Emma, the wife of King Ethelred? Well, as the widow of King Ethelred, Emma would have been considered queen, so marrying the queen lends you credibility and legitimacy in the eyes of the English nobles. Plus, it's a pretty good insurance policy against invasions from ambitious Normans. Canute's marriage to Queen Emma produced another son, Canute, born around 3 years after Harold. Because Emma was the queen when Canute died, it was considered that Canute, then around 17, was the rightful heir to the English throne, not Harold. When Canute died in 1035, it was expected that Canute would be crowned and rule as King of Denmark and England, just like his father. So that's why there was opposition to Harold being crowned in the first place. Only Canute was actually in Denmark at the time of his father's death, and he was unable to get to his own coronation because his Danish kingdom was being threatened with invasion. So, he had to stay put. While everyone was waiting for Canute, Harold, quick as a flash, or as quick as a hare, galloped down to the Witan, a kind of anglo-saxon court of noblemen, to stake his claim, alongside his mother AElfgifu, who was there to certify his legitimacy. It's possible he was known as Harefoot because of his fleet of foot whilst hunting, but it's also possible it's because of the speed with which he staked his claim. It appears that the Witan decided to install Harold as the king, though it's possible they saw him as just a regent who would rule on his brother's behalf until Canute could show up. Then, as now, it's a legal requirement for kings and queens of England to be crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Ethelnoth, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, agreed to crown him, but refused to use the official royal regalia. This meant that, for Harold, being crowned turned out to be a bit of an empty gesture. The new king took his frustrations out by rejecting Christianity and refusing to attend church services. To add insult to injury, many of the leading nobles in England refused to recognise him as king. Chief among those were Godwin of Wessex, a powerful earl whose son Harold II would eventually be the last Wessex king of England before his defeat at the Battle of Hastings, something we'll cover in a later video. The result of all this was that, while Harold Harefoot ruled the north of England, the nobility initially said that Canute was king in the south. In time, though, when it was clear Canute wasn't coming, and that support for Harold was growing, the southern nobles switched sides and supported Harold. During this time, Canute's mother, Emma of Normandy, was more or less confined to Winchester. As mentioned, she'd previously been married to the Wessex king, AEthelred the Unready, and this marriage had produced 2 sons, Edward, who would later be King of England and known as Edward the Confessor, and Alfred. Both sons remained in exile in Normandy during Harold's reign, probably for their own safety. But in 1036, the two brothers received a letter from their mother in Winchester inviting them back to England. There is some dispute about whether the letter was really from Emma, or whether it was a ruse by Harold to lure and entrap the two brothers. And Harold would have had a motive to do this. Killing the two elder sons of the former queen perhaps would have drawn a line under any challenges to his rule from that side. Whether or not the letter was genuine, Edward and Alfred nevertheless made their way to England with their respective armies. Edward carried out a raid on Southampton and returned to Normandy with his booty. It appears that Alfred, on the other hand, was met by Godwin of Wessex, taken to King Harold and blinded, a way of guaranteeing he couldn't challenge Harold, as blind men weren't allowed to sit on the throne. Alfred died days later of his injuries. It's no surprise that Alfred's brother Edward would later hold Godwin partly responsible for his brother's death. This is very significant for an understanding of the Norman invasion that came 30 years later in 1066. Edward would later find himself on the throne of England, but, as he was childless, he was forced to cast about for an heir as he neared the end of his life. The two main contenders were William, the son of his cousin Robert of Normandy, and Harold, Godwin of Wessex's own son. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a written record from the time, has it that the dying Edward promised the throne to Harold, whereas William himself claimed Edward had actually promised the throne to him. So which is it? William, his blood relative, in other words, the grandson of his mother Emma's brother, or Harold, the son of the man Edward held responsible for his brother's death? We don't know what happened, but when you look at these events through the lens of 1036, William the Conqueror's claim starts to look a bit stronger. After Alfred was killed, Emma of Normandy was driven into exile. We don't know much about Harold's reign after this, though we do know he launched an attack on the Welsh who sent him packing. He died in March 1040 in Oxford and was buried at Westminster Abbey, although this didn't last long. Emma's son Harold Canute, who had previously found himself stuck in Denmark, was invited to England to finally become king, and one of his first acts was to disinter Harold's body, behead it, and throw it into a fen. Harold's body was recovered by some fishermen, and a group of resident Danes in London buried him in St Clement Danes Church at the end of Fleet Street. In our next video, we'll cover the life of Harold Canute and his brief reign as King of England. Please remember to hit the subscribe button below to receive an alert when we upload our next video. You can also support us via Patreon using the link below.